All right, let's talk about someone you probably think you know pretty well, the Apostle Paul. He's a monumental figure, right? But what if I told you a new theory is asking us to rethink everything? Who he was, when he lived, and even if his famous letters are what they seem. Let's dive into this radical new idea.
So, where's all this coming from? Well, it's from a book by Professor Nina E. Livesey, and it's making some serious waves. She's proposing a complete reinterpretation of some of Christianity's most foundational texts. The book suggests that what we've long accepted as historical fact might be something else entirely. And trust me, this isn't just a dusty academic debate. It gets to the very heart of how we understand our own history.
Okay, so before we jump into the deep end, let's quickly remind ourselves of the conventional story, the one that's been the bedrock of scholarship for more than a century. This is the Paul most of us learned about.
And here it is, the consensus view. For ages, the story has been that a real, historical Paul traveled the Roman Empire around the 50s and 60s CE. He founded these small, new Christian communities and wrote very personal, often urgent letters back to them. And for the most part, scholars agree that at least 7 of these letters are the real deal, authentic correspondence written by Paul to solve actual problems happening on the ground.
But Livesey's research comes along and doesn't just question a few details, it challenges the entire framework. Her theory isn't a minor adjustment, it's a proposal to tear the whole thing down and rebuild it from scratch.
And this chart just lays it out perfectly. The consensus view says, first century, real letters, historical person. Livesey's thesis, second century, literary fiction, and a fictional character named Paul. It's a night and day difference. So the big question is, how on earth does she make this case? Well, her argument is built on 3 main pillars.
The first pillar forces us to ask a really basic question about these documents. Are they actually personal mail, or are they something else, just cleverly disguised as letters for a very specific reason?
Livesey's answer is that they're not real letters. They're what's called letters in form only, or mock letters. The idea is that an author, writing under a famous name, in this case Paul, is using the letter format as a powerful literary tool. It's a deliberate strategy, a way to frame a message that has nothing to do with actually writing to a church in Corinth.
So if it's not correspondence, what is it? She argues it's a type of protreptic rhetoric. Now that sounds fancy, but the concept is simple. It's persuasive writing. It's not meant for a private reader. It's designed for a wide audience to try and convince them to adopt a new philosophy or way of life. Think of it less like a personal email and more like a brilliant, persuasive op-ed.
And this wasn't some newfangled idea. Livesey draws a fantastic parallel to the Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca. His famous moral epistles look like letters, but everyone knows they're really philosophical essays meant for the public. Why? Because the letter format feels personal, direct, and engaging. Livesey argues the authors of the Pauline letters were using the exact same playbook for the exact same reasons.
So in this view, the letter format becomes a kind of staging ground. The character of Paul is the wise, authoritative teacher, and the communities he's writing to, they're his mock students. All their supposed problems, the infighting, the bad theology, they aren't real historical events. They're basically plot devices, created to give Paul the perfect excuse to teach a lesson to a much, much bigger audience.
This brings us to the second pillar. If the letters are a kind of literary performance, then that begs the question, when was this performance actually staged? This is where the story takes a sharp turn out of the first century.
Just look at this timeline. It shows what a massive shift we're talking about. The traditional date is mid-1st century. But Livesey points out that our earliest hard evidence for a collection of Paul's letters doesn't show up until around 144 CE. That's almost a century later. It comes from the school of Marcion in Rome. And notice what happens right before that. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, a truly catastrophic war between Jews and the Roman Empire.
So why does that revolt matter so much? Because, and this is the key, the content of Paul's letters suddenly clicks into place in the aftermath of that war. All those intense arguments devaluing Jewish law and tradition, Livesey argues they make way more sense in a 2nd century world where a new Christian movement was trying to create an identity totally separate from its Jewish roots. Plus, you had Marcion's school, which not only had a reason to promote this version of Paul, but also had the resources, the scribes, the networks, to create and circulate a collection like this.
And all of this leads to the third, and let's be honest, the most provocative pillar of her theory. If the letters are actually 2nd century literary works, then what does that imply about their supposed author?
Yep, this is the big one. Livesey argues that outside of the Bible, there's no reliable external evidence that the historical Paul ever existed. Every single thing we know about his life ultimately traces back to the very documents that are being questioned, the letters themselves and the book of Acts.
So from this perspective, all those vivid autobiographical details, Paul's dramatic conversion, his struggles, his passionate arguments, they aren't historical memories. They are literary devices. They are brilliant pieces of character development designed to create a convincing, authoritative, and compelling persona for this fictional author. Paul is the hero of his own story.
So, how did we end up thinking he was real for so long? Well, Livesey points to what she calls a major methodological trap. A classic case of circular reasoning. Here's how it works. Step 1, scholars use the letters to piece together a biography of Paul. Step 2, they use that very same biography they just created to argue that the letters must be authentic. See the problem? It's a self-reinforcing loop with no outside proof to anchor it to reality.
Livesey traces this entire way of thinking back to very influential scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries. She argues that people like Adolf Deisman were driven by a sort of romantic, idealized vision of a pure and primitive early Christianity. They wanted the letters to be simple, heartfelt, non-literary messages, and she contends that theological preference led them to classify the letters as real, which in turn revived an old argument from the Dutch radical school that had also pointed to a second-century origin.
Okay, so deep breath. An academic debate about 2,000-year-old letters, why does any of this matter today? Well, the implications are actually huge and go way beyond ancient history.
And it's hard. A theory like this forces us all to ask really critical questions about how we know anything about the past. It's a masterclass in source criticism. It reminds us that even our most foundational stories are built on interpretation, on evidence we have, and just as importantly, on the evidence we don't have.
And that leaves us with one final, crucial question to think about. Rethinking the origin of the Pauline letters isn't just an intellectual game. It's a deep dive into how foundational stories get created, passed down, and eventually accepted as truth. If those very stories can be read in such a radically different light, what does that change about how we see the institutions, ideas, and cultures they helped build today? Now that is a question worth considering.